Hello, welcome to this session on divorcing grammar instruction from classism and white supremacy. I am Dr. Lisa Loomis-Davern. As of Monday, I will be an acting assistant principal in Hartford Public Schools in Hartford, Connecticut. I started my career for 16 years as a middle and high school English teacher. And I'm sorry to say I did not use the strategies that I'm going to share with you today because I didn't have the knowledge then that I have now. For the last 4 years, I've been studying equity in education. And for the last 3 years, I have been an instructional coach for 6th through 12th grade ELA teachers in Hartford. And that's really where this work evolved from. And as you can see, I'm white. And I think it's essential if we're going to end white supremacy that white people call out white supremacy wherever and whenever they see it. And so that's what I'm trying to do. However, if because of the white privilege that I have and grew up with, if I miss something or get something wrong, I am hoping that you will reach out to me so I can continue to learn and grow and be a better ally and accomplice. And so with that, let's get into it. Now, we can't really talk about divorcing grammar from classism and white supremacy until we have a sense of how intimately those things are intertwined. So we're going to start there. So the relationship between language and class is made very clear in the musical My Fair Lady. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with this musical, it's set in London, where a professor of linguistics attempts to prove he can change someone's social class simply by changing the way they speak. And he selects a woman who sells flowers in the street as his test subject. And we're going to watch a brief clip of the turning point in the musical.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
I can't! I'm so tired! I'm so tired!
For God's sake, Higgins, it must be 3 o'clock in the morning. Do be reasonable.
I am always reasonable. Eliza, if I can go on with a blistering headache, you can.
I got an headache too.
Oh, here. I know your headaches. I know you're tired. I know your nerves are as raw as meat in a butcher's window. But think what you're trying to accomplish. Just think what you're dealing with. The majesty and grandeur of the English language is the greatest possession we have. The noblest thoughts that ever flowed through the hearts of men are contained in its extraordinary, imaginative, and musical mixtures of sounds. And that's what you've set yourself out to conquer, Eliza. And conquer it you will. Now try it again.
The rain in Spain stays mainly in the plain.
What was that?
So I think what's really interesting there is the way that he describes the English language, and in his use of adjectives like grandeur and majesty, he's really articulating this hierarchy of language that we have baked into our culture, with Standard English at the top. And I also think it's really interesting that he uses the word conquer when he's talking to Eliza, because during the Age of Empire, that's what white Europeans did. They went to lands inhabited by primarily Black and brown people and conquered those people, colonized those lands, enslaved those people, and that's when our modern concept of race developed as a way of justifying that colonization and enslavement. And that age of empire and enslavement had an enormous impact on language. So for the first time, you had people with different languages needing to communicate with each other more than ever before. And there was also a power dynamic involved. So Europeans created new governments in their colonies and used their language, of course, as the official language of the government, and therefore the language of power. And so indigenous people who wanted to access that power needed to learn that language. You also had enslaved people who needed to communicate with their enslavers and their overseers. In the US, the overseers were often indentured servants who spoke dialects that were not the standard English of the white property owners. And you also had enslaved people who were enslaved with others who were from different regions or tribes, and therefore who spoke different languages. And they all needed to learn how to communicate with one another and do so in a way that their enslavers could not understand. So this led to the development of new languages within a hierarchy. And we see a little glimpse of that in this table. And as you can see, we've got a few countries, all of which were countries that were originally inhabited by Black or brown people. The government in those countries has as its official language the language of the colonizers, but the language of the people is a language that was either indigenous to that area, as with Quechua in Peru or Xhosa in South Africa, or you have languages or dialects that developed from the intermingling of a variety of languages, and that's where we get Jamaican Patois and Haitian Creole and Afrikaans. And I just want to note that I'm using the words language and dialect interchangeably. The Linguistic Society of America says that that distinction is more of a political distinction than a linguistic distinction. So I'm using those interchangeably now. So it's pretty clear or easy to see the development of these different languages and the hierarchy or the power dynamic at play when you're looking outside of your own country, outside of your own culture. But this happened in the United States as well. And here, of course, the language of government and power is standard English. And I put that as unofficial because the United States does not have an official language, although many people believe it is English. There is not an official language. However, we know that in order to access power and resources in this country, one needs to have mastered standard English usually. And there are many dialects that have developed within the United States, but we're going to focus in this session on African American Vernacular English, also known as Black English, also known as Ebonics. And the reason that we're focusing here is because there is this intersection of classism and white supremacy that have led people to discredit African American Vernacular English as a legitimate or correct way of speaking, and to see the people who speak using that language or dialect as inferior. But I do want to point out that the Linguistic Society of America has stated that the systematic, I'm quoting here, the systematic and expressive nature of the grammar and pronunciation patterns of the African American vernacular has been established by numerous scientific studies over the past 30 years. Characterizations of Ebonics as slang, mutant, lazy, defective, ungrammatical, or broken English are incorrect and demeaning. And we'll come back to this statement a little bit later, but we're going to leave it there for now. So it's important that we point out that the hypocrisy of considering people who speak African American Vernacular English as inferior and less than comes from the fact that we had laws on the books, we being white property owning people who had influence in government, created laws that made it illegal to teach enslaved people how to read or write and therefore master standard English. That this was one of the ways that white land property owning people maintained their power. And this is really just the beginning of a trend, of a pattern within US history of using literacy to prevent people from accessing resources and exercising rights. So for example, we have the Immigration Act of 1917 that required immigrants to pass a literacy test. We had many states in both the North and the South that had laws that required people to pass a literacy test in order to vote. And we think of this usually as belonging to the South, but this is a newspaper article from East Aurora, New York. My home state of Connecticut was the first state to pass a law like this, which was 1855, and Connecticut is considered one of the most progressive states in the country. So this was not relegated just to the South. So what we see is that literacy has been used throughout US and world history to disenfranchise non-white people. And maybe the whole concept of literacy was established precisely for this purpose. And the practice has really never ended. Via the SAT, students are still expected to show mastery of standard English to access college. And this puts all students who do not have standard English as their home language at a disadvantage. And the idea that standard English is superior and other languages and dialects are inferior, therefore, persists. Now, this is problematic because when we tell our students that their home language is inappropriate or improper or incorrect or unwelcome, we dehumanize them. And that happens in our schools all the time. And I would like to share a clip with you, not in reference to African American Vernacular English this time, but in reference to students whose home language is Spanish.
American. Military men and women fighting are not fighting for your right to speak Spanish, they're fighting for your right to speak American. You want to leave? Be disrespectful? Leave? Disrespectful?
I really first began to understand this connection between language and identity by reading The Skin That We Speak, edited by Lisa Delpit. And Zaretta Hammond, in her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, tells us that ignoring or rejecting a student's home language is a microaggression, and that when students experience microaggressions, that triggers a response within the amygdala, which is where we identify threats, and that triggers the fight or flight response. And so when that happens, learning can no longer happen for a period of time. And I think we can see really clearly in that clip the way that those students are dehumanized and the effect that it has on them. On the other hand, Hammond tells us that acknowledging, embracing, and utilizing a student's home language helps us build trust and rapport with them. And it also allows students to tap into their background knowledge, which is essential for learning. So until our society changes as far as getting rid of this hierarchy of languages, our students are at a disadvantage if they have not or do not master standard English. And that puts us as English teachers in this really difficult position where we are asking ourselves, how do we teach our students to master the language of their oppressor without further oppressing them? And to do that, we first have to move from focusing on our students' deficits to focusing on their assets, particularly as they relate to language and literacy. So for example, when we call kids English language learners, we're focusing on the deficit that they do not know yet how to speak English, or they're not fluent yet in English. We can instead call them emerging bilinguals, which emphasizes the asset that they already have a language and they're working on becoming fluent and literate in another one. Many of our students who come from non-Western cultures come from cultures that have a strong oral tradition as part of their history, and that is a huge language literacy asset. They communicate in metaphors, and Dr. Goldie Muhammad in her book, Cultivating Genius, talks about the Black literary societies of the 19th century and the characteristics and skills that were developed and utilized within those societies, such as collaborating with one another and critiquing each other's ideas and the ideas within the text that they were reading. And these are all key learning and literacy skills that we can draw on as we are focusing on our students' assets rather than thinking about their deficits. So with that, having made that mind shift from deficit to asset, we're now ready to take a look at strategies that validate our students' home languages. The first is, and this is first for a reason. We need to explicitly acknowledge the power dynamics at play within our language system and celebrate bilingualism. So we need to explicitly acknowledge that by suggesting other languages are inferior to standard English, we are practicing a form of white supremacy. And you can do this in different ways. You might have students list all the places where they use their home language or African American vernacular, and list all the places where they are expected to use standard English, and ask them to notice a pattern or compare and contrast those places. But the benefits of explicitly acknowledging this is that you're affirming and validating your student's identity, and that will help you build trust and rapport. And stating that they are not inferior for not knowing standard English will undermine internalized oppression that they may have developed. And celebrating their being bi or multilingual and being able to code switch will help develop in their self-image. The next strategy I'd like to share is one that taps into students' background knowledge, which, as I mentioned before, is something that Zaretta Hammond really emphasizes in her book. And so that's using the student's native or home language to introduce new grammar concepts. So for example, that might look like when you're introducing parts of speech or parts of sentences, having students first identify those things in a sentence from their native or home language. Another example of that might be to say, today we're learning about how to show possession in standard English, but first write a sentence in your native language that has possession in it. Who is possessing what? How did you show that? Here is how we show possession in standard English. And that second example is getting into the third strategy, which is having students do a contrastive analysis. And this is something that Wheeler and Swords talk about in their work. So a contrastive analysis is an activity in which you are contrasting two different languages. And you're still utilizing the students' background knowledge of their home language. So an example would be, today we're learning about syntax, which is the order of words or phrases in a sentence. Look at this sentence in Spanish and the sentence in English. They're saying the same thing, but the syntax is different. Can you figure out how? So this is obviously for students whose home language is Spanish, and you give them their sentence from their home language and their sentence from standard English, and have them find the differences. Another example would be to say to students, one characteristic of their home language, in this case, African American vernacular English, is using multiple negatives to affirm a negative. And you could give them some examples of that, or you could ask them for some examples and say, this is called emphatic negation. And it's also in Spanish, French, Italian, Russian, Hebrew, and other languages. This will help them to see that this characteristic of their dialect or their language is something that's shared in other languages as well. It helps, it validates and affirms that. However, in standard English, when we use two negatives, they cancel each other out. So we're doing this contrasting of their home language and standard English. And not to say that their language is wrong, just that these two languages are different. And the idea that multiple negatives affirming a negative is called emphatic negation, and is a characteristic of multiple languages, was new learning for me pretty recently. And so you might be saying, like, well, how would I possibly know that? How am I going to learn the grammatical linguistic structures of all of my students' home languages? I will share some resources with you for that when we get to the end. And the other strategy I want to share is having students code switch or translate from their native language to standard English. And this is something also, again, that Wheeler and Swords write about. Also, Dr. Shiraki Holly in his work, Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Teaching and Learning. So this one is particularly good when you're having students write. When you notice that a characteristic of their native language has crept into their use of standard English, you can either identify that for them and ask them to change it or translate it, or you can ask students to see if they can identify where that characteristic has crept in and then have them remove it or change it. But not the key here is framing this not as correcting them as if what they have done is wrong, but helping them notice that they have used a structure that comes from their home language that is not a part of standard English, and asking them to translate or change that. So, as I said, in order to do some of these, it's essential for you to know the home language. First, you just have to know the home language of your students. And hopefully that's something that you learn that as part of getting to know your students at the beginning of the year. But you also have to know the characteristics of those languages and how they compare to English. And that can seem like a very overwhelming thing, but it's really not as overwhelming as you think. So there is a YouTube channel called Lang Focus, and I'll show you that really quickly. This person has done videos on many different languages, and you can see that they range from 8 minutes to 20 minutes long. And just watching one of these videos will give you a really strong foundation in some of the basics between one language and standard English. So I highly recommend that you take a look at the Lang Focus channel on YouTube. And I have some other resources here that go into African American vernacular English, the Lang Focus video. There's another video on YouTube from BET.
Friends
that
would
talks
walk
about some background on African American vernacular English. And I have some articles as well that I found that I would be happy to share. Even just Wikipedia to give you some sort of background is a good place to start. So I feel like I have to point out that this is not, that you could get some backlash for doing this work. Now, way back in 1996, the Oakland School District in California was really ahead of its time in recognizing Black English as a language, so that teachers would treat students whose first language was Black English as potentially bilingual students, and use that as background knowledge to support their teaching of standard English. This was portrayed very negatively in the media. So there was a huge backlash. This I Has a Dream is an ad that the National Head Start Association took out in newspapers, and even beloved Maya Angelou did not support this. Here's what she had to say about it.
I am incensed. The very idea that African American language is a language separate from can be very threatening. because it can encourage young men and women not to learn standard English. There's been a movement afoot for many years which has frightened me. I don't know who's behind it. I don't believe that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I don't. So I don't believe that if a movement is instigated by black people that it's necessarily good for black people. I don't believe that.
And Reverend Jesse Jackson was also someone who pushed back against this, and the Oakland School District ended up rewriting their policy and really taking out reference to Black English as a language, taking it out. But really, the backlash was in response. They did not really understand what the Oakland School District was, the intention was. They were, you know, when there is white supremacy, these things become much more politicized than grounded in sound pedagogy. So you might get pushback, and you might get it from places that you don't expect. And that, in response to the Oakland School District's decision and the backlash that they received, that's when the Linguistic Society of America made this statement in 1997. And they affirmed that there are individual and group benefits to maintaining vernacular speech varieties, and there are scientific and human advantages to linguistic diversity. For those living in the United States, there are also benefits in acquiring standard English, and resources should be made available to all who aspire to mastery of standard English. And then to the final item, there is evidence from Sweden, the US, and other countries that speakers of other varieties can be aided in their learning of the standard variety by pedagogical approaches which recognize the legitimacy of the other varieties of a language. From this perspective, the Oakland School Board's decision to recognize the vernacular of African American students in teaching them standard English is linguistically and pedagogically sound. So you can be confident as you are beginning to implement these strategies that experts in linguistics, in the brain, in culturally responsive practices are all behind using these strategies. These are the works I referenced. And I'm happy to share any of the resources that I mentioned, or answer any questions or respond to any feedback. You can find me on Twitter at LJ Loomis-Davern, or you can email me at lisa.loomis@hartfordschools.org.